Um, all right. Just letting you all know that you're now being recorded. All right.
Understood.
So Berlin 1945. I got started on this because I just happened to come across um, one of these shows where, one of these things where, as a
Thank you.
tidbit, let's talk about this, and I'll mention the very picture that sent me to this idea to talk about it. So this is a famed photo. This is the Russian army pinning their flag to the top of the Reichstag at the not at the end, in the middle of the Battle of Berlin. And there's a couple things about this photo. It's sort of the Eastern Europe, or it's sort of the Eastern Front version of the flag raising on Iwo Jima. It had this, big patriotic effect for the Russians, as did the Iwo Jima flag did for the U.S. Um, and Stalin had basically said he was going to give a special, award to the first unit to raise a flag on the Reichstag. So there was this brutal, bloody race to be the first ones to raise. This actual picture is a staged recreation. And you can tell it's a staged recreation because if you look in the background, there's people wandering around and trucks wandering around. When they actually raised the flag, it had been the result of a day-long floor by floor battle in the Reichstag itself as they went, floor by floor, clearing it out to get to the roof. So this is a recreation a couple of days later, but by the people that had um, raised the flag. So it's uh, unlike the Iwo Jima photo, which was legitimately taken right at the moment. This was taken. This was restaged for propaganda purposes. But nevertheless, the event did happen and did have that effect for the Russians. But we'll talk about this. So, where do we start? So we start back in December of 44. Um, and the Western Allies had just started pushing back from the Ardennes offensive, and the Germans, um, and we have in red on the right is the what's the territory regained by the Russians. On red on the left would be the territory regained and held by the Allies. The white in the middle is that still under the control of the Germans, and gray, of course, is neutral. And the red, dark red on the right is recent gains by the Russian army. Um, and the Germans are trying to counteroffense against the Russians to retake Bucharest, which has just recently fallen. You can see on the extreme left, the black bit is actually the German incursion during the Battle of the Bulge. That's where they punched that big of a bulge into the Western Allied line. And at the end of December, the Western Allies are just beginning to push back on that bulge. So this is the conditions that we're on in December of 31. December 31. January 31 of 1945, the Russians have begun their major 1945 uh, um, uh, pushing forward. The Western Allies are making slight gains. The bulge has been eliminated. But the Russians gained 300 miles, clearing most of Poland and East Prussia. And they take Warsaw, and they are advancing. And they get within, about 100 miles of Berlin at this point with this advance by the end of um, January. The Western Allies, meanwhile, are gathering their forces to get ready to cross the Rhine. You can see they're still short of Cologne and they're still short of the Rhine at this time. By February 1945, the Russians are now just 35 miles away from Berlin on the Oder River. But the Western Allies are 250 miles from Berlin. And there becomes a debate about should we go for Berlin or what are our goals? And it's around this time that Eisenhower decides that no, we're not going to go for Berlin. He said the natural objective beyond the Ruhr was Berlin. It was politically and psychologically important as the symbol of remaining German power. I decided, however, that it was not logical or the most desirable objective for the forces of the Western Allies. And while they're debating whether they should go for Berlin or not, they actually are conjure up a plan to drop airborne troops into Berlin as part of their advance. This will be get really interesting when we see how hard the Russians have to fight to get into Berlin. The thought that the Western Allies could push the 250 miles and get there, um, it's just not comprehensible, really. Um, Ike will then decide that instead, let the Russians take Berlin. We're going to concentrate on just bagging and capturing as much of the German army as we can and getting them to surrender. That becomes their focus, even though there will be people in the Western Allies, people like Patton and Monty are like, oh, let me go to Berlin. I'll go to Berlin. I'll be there in a week. I'm like, yeah, no. So by March of 1945, the Western Allies have decided to take out the Ruhr industrial area and eliminating the German armies in the West. I meant the West, not the East. And you can see that they begin their advantage and they create the Ruhr pocket around Cologne. Um, the Russians are advancing but they really are just consolidating during this time on the Oder River and cleaning up surrounded pockets of Germans that they've left behind them. Um, March of 1935, this is where we stand, and Berlin's not even under threat. But we get to April 15th, and the Russians have captured Vienna in the south. But the resistance to the Western Allies is pretty much completely collapsed on the Western Front. You can see the massive advances that the Western Allies are making. Um, and the Allies will shortly meet along the Elbe River, which is where Ike has told his armies to come to a stop. When you get to the Elbe, just wait there for the Russians. And there will eventually be the famous meeting where they shake hands and share champagne as they cut Germany in two. But by April 15th, the Russians are just about to begin their offensive on Berlin. So the Russian attack begins, and one thing Stalin does is he tells his leading generals Zhukov and Kondev that he basically challenges each of them to get to Berlin first, take Berlin first, and he sets them against each other as a competitive thing. And this is a famed thing that um, Stalin liked to do. Zhukov sort of is the most famous, and they even consider him sort of the best general of the Russians had in World War II. And I don't really hear as much about Konvev as you do nowadays as you hear about Zhukov or Chukov. Zhukov Zhukov had actually whetted his teeth against the Japanese prior to the Operation Barbarossa. He had held off the Japanese in the in a fight that had happened prior, like April of 41. He was then famous for his taking the lead of the defense of Stalingrad and the relief of Stalingrad and the surrounding of the German army. And he's been a major leading force in Russian success since then. So he's sort of their leading general. He thought he was going to be given the okay to go take Berlin, but then he's set up in a competitive situation. Zhukov sets up his attack on the Oder River, and he's going to set up this massive attack, and he begins firing 1 million shells fired onto the Russians fired on the German positions west of the Oder, and it's one of the largest bombardments in history. But the Germans had fallen back. They had set up 3 or 4 defensive lines west of the Oder River, and they knew that this attack was coming, so they abandoned pretty much the first line of defense and fell back onto what the more defensible position on the thing called the Zilo Heights, which are behind the Oder River. And so the Russian bombardment, while massive, really fell on nothing. And then the Russians began to swarm across the Oder River and figured they're going to have a walk, and they hit the German positions on the Zilo Heights. Zhukov will attack for 3 straight days, just accepting huge casualties. He's just like, go, go, go. And, but will eventually break through, but has huge casualties. And surprisingly, even at this late stage of the war, the Russians are still using shock troops at the front, which are meant to be basically disposable. Those are the guys being prodded along with bayonets. Some of those leading units are actual penal battalions. This all sounds very familiar from the recent war in the Ukraine. And the best troops with all the best equipment and the best training are meant to come behind those shock troops. Let the shock troops take all the casualties and then exploit the opening with the good troops. And that's Zhukov's approach. And he just is willing to accept massive casualties, just an absolute meat grinder. We get to April 20th. The German positions have broken through in the Zilo Heights. The Russians are beginning to advance on Berlin. But on April 20th, it's Hitler's 56th birthday. It's the last time he's seen in public. He goes out of his bunker to, uh, congratulate a few Hitler youth that had stopped some Russian tanks. But he learns also that FDR dies, and and Goebbels is telling him, "Oh, this is a sign that we can still win the war with FDR out of the war." But on April 20th, Hitler's birthday, FDR dies. We can still win, and that's when the Russians begin to shell Berlin directly. They've gotten close enough that they can begin to shell the city. Coming towards Berlin at this point is 2.5 million men of the Russian army, including, and 60,000 of whom are Poles. There's 6,000 tanks, 7,500 aircraft, 41,000 artillery pieces and mortars, 3,200 of the Katyusha rocket launchers. Those are the trucks that have the multiple barreled rocket launchers on them that the Russians like to use and the German soldiers hated.
Right.
And then they had over 95,000 motor vehicles. So this massive army is going to fall on Berlin. And um, the German defenses of several 100,000 people made up of some regular troops, but also a mixed bag of the Berlin police force, the anti-aircraft gun units of the Luftwaffe, some naval units, Hitler Youth, and then and then the Volksguard, which are basically just civilians that are handed a rifle and a rocket grenade and said, "Go stop the Russians," But several 100,000 defenders of Berlin are preparing to meet 2.5 million heavily armed Russians.
Hmm.
The
Mr.
Russian
Bolson.
approach is they basically decide that before they try to pound their way into Berlin, they're going to cut Berlin off. They're going to encircle Berlin. That's going to be their strategy, and then they'll take on Berlin itself.
Bruce, the Poles that were you mentioned, 60,000, um were those like nominally free Polish troops that had been liberated and now were fighting as allies, or were they
Yeah, yeah. They
impressed into the Russian
nominally,
army?
free Polish as much as you can be free Polish under the Russians, right?
Okay, but
But
they weren't Poles that had been impressed into the Russian army during the occupation.
the borderline on impression versus freedom.
Okay,
Yeah. But they were
okay,
their own units. They were formed into units
okay.
of full units of Poles.
All right. Thanks.
Um, by April 22nd, what's happened is British mosquito bombers have hit tactical sites in Berlin repeatedly on 417 through 420. There's the last bombardment. There's a 1,000 plane raid just before this that's reducing much of Berlin to rubble. The Russian plan was to encircle the city first. And at this point, Hitler, when the city gets encircled, he orders German units to break the encirclement. And he particularly famously orders this General Steiner to organize a breakthrough by his unit into this German. But Steiner um, all he has is a headquarters unit and a police battalion and one anti-aircraft unit, and he can't gather up any forces. So after trying for a while to organize some forces to do this breakthrough that he's been ordered to do, he basically radios headquarters and says, I ain't got anybody. I can't do it. And there's when they explain this to Hitler that Steiner's not about to break through because there are no troops available, he goes into an absolute rage about how the army has failed him and he should have killed all the generals in the first place, and he's failed. There's a famous recreation of this scene in the movie The Bunker, which recreates Hitler's last day. Um, and it's just an amazing thing. But this is where Hitler is just living on fantasy. He's moving pieces around on the board. He's like, take this division. Well, that division is down to a couple hundred guys in one tank. He's just living in a unreal fantasy world at this point. Um, he will, at the end of his rage, to say, I'll just stay in Berlin in the end, and then I'll kill myself. They'll never get me alive. The Germans have realized that the Western Allies won't push east of the Elbe River and are able to transfer some of their units to face the Russians. They've given up on defending against the Western Allies. They're going to just be able to move units to face the Russians. Probably not a good part on our thing and they are able to figure this out because they were able to get a copy of this Operation Eclipse, which was drafted back in February of 45, which outlined the occupation of Germany. And it's like, here's how we'll do it, and who's get what sector. That operational plan falls into German hands. And it's where they learn that the Allies don't plan to come west. The Western Allies won't come east of the Elbe. And they also learn that they're going to divide Germany up into these occupied territories. And that news is what the Goebbels and the propaganda machine are able to, they're going to dismember Germany. And they're able to get, people to fight to the last on the idea that this is what's going to happen to them after the war. On April 23rd, knowing that Hitler is cut off and in Berlin, Goring, the head of the Luftwaffe, and in theory at the time, the second in command of Nazi Germany at that point, suggests that he should take over command of Germany because Hitler being surrounded is sort of in an incapacitated situation. Rather than taking this as a logical conclusion of their condition that they're in, Hitler sees this as an act of revenge and orders Goering to be stripped of his policies and arrested and shot. Everything is now, the paranoia is just so deep that he can really no longer function rationally. By April 25, Berlin is completely surrounded. Here, the German defenders number about 45,000. I had a couple 100,000. The numbers are squishy here. And the Soviets forces have penetrated Berlin itself as far as the outer suburbs of Berlin. And so there's these rings of subways and stuff in Berlin, and those are what's known as the defense rings. So the S-Bahn Railway, which is an outer suburban ring. And what you see is a map of the conditions on this day, April 25th. They've completed the surrounding of Berlin. And it's got the marking of the 4th Panzer Army and the 9th Panzer Army just southeast of Berlin, trying to still hold the front. But these troops are beginning to be cut off themselves and surrounded. So we wind up with the Battle of the Halbe Pocket. This is outside Berlin, and it occurs from April 24th to May 1st. The 9th Army, and the 9th Army is marked on this map. You can see it just to the southeast of Berlin. The 9th German Army is surrounded in the Spree Forest, southeast of Berlin, and they're trying to break out west to link up with the 12th Army, if they can break out west. And they basically have to fight their way through 3 lines of Soviet troops, Soviet armies that have just cut them off. Only one third of this force will make it to the West to be able to surrender to the Western Allies. Why are they trying to break out? They're not trying to get to the defense of Berlin. They're trying to break out so they can surrender to the Western Allies rather than the Russians. About a third of them are killed, and about a third of them wind up having to surrender to the Russians. So this is the destruction of one of the last key standing armies that are in the area for the Germans. April 27th, um, someone comes to Hitler and says, "Hey, look, let's break out of Berlin. Let's get the hell out of here while we still can." And he says, "Your proposal is perfectly all right, but what is the point of it all? I have no intentions of wandering around in the woods. I'm staying here and I will fall at the head of my troops. You, for your part, will carry on with your defense. So I'm not leaving. I'm going to die here in Berlin." And on this day, the Russians captured Tempelhof Airport. And there's this picture of the famed um, Tempelhof Airport terminal. It was designed and built by the Germans in time for the Olympics, and it was meant to be this grandiose part of the grandiose buildings the Germans love to build and design. So they captured Tempelhof Airport. They've cut it off. It can no longer be used to bring supplies to the surrounded troops. To replace Tempelhof, the Germans will start landing airplanes on a rickety airfield they've used on one of the boulevards right inside of Berlin itself near the Reichsgarten. They take 2,000 German women and they force them to clear the runway so they can begin to use the airport for operations. They basically, at the force of bayonet, cause these German civilian women to start clearing the runways. And the Russians reach out to the various utilities that are in the city and saying, "We now control the city. You are under our control. You will operate under our orders, or else." You know, they're given those orders. You will now do it. Berlin is now totally surrounded on the 27th of April. And the Germans begin their advance into the city. And basically what the Russians do is they take to take a building, they will pound it with artillery first, then bring up tanks supported by troop teams of about 80 infantry. The tanks will come up and support the infantry by, continuing fire, direct fire into the building. Then the infantry will go in and have to clear out the building room by room. This is bloody and awful. And the German defenders are using their Panzerfaust, which are those handheld rocket launchers that they've got, and they've handed them out, and they're deadly to tanks and city fighting. And they've also got the Panzer Schreck, which is the German version of the bazooka. And so every time a tank shows up, the tanks are not lasting very long. They'll take out the tanks. This picture on the left is one of the German flak towers that got built. And I believe that this is actually a picture of the flak tower that they built where the Berlin Zoo now is. This tower has been since torn down, post-war torn down. But they built these flak towers to prevent against the bombers. But during the Battle of Berlin, units based in these flak towers would be taking out Russian tanks as they advanced. And so there were yeah.
The towers were not conquered like the building on the right. They finally opened their doors after the quiet had come.
Oh, so they were never conquered. They could have held out on their own.
But then you said they was demolished. Many of them were not because of the fantastic cost to bring them down.
Yeah, the one that's right they talk about the zoo flak tower, and that one was in fact demolished. That's the zoo flak tower was the closest one to the Reichstag. Because they were massive concrete structures, right? Part of the defenders of Berlin were two SS brigades, the SS Charlemagne and the SS Nordland, and they make up an interesting group of people. SS Charlemagne were French collaborators who were serving in the German and the Waffen SS. And they were French collaborators. And the Nordland was made up of other foreign volunteers with large contingent of Romanians, but it's got other people. It's got Danes in it and Norwegians. And these groups um, are sent to Berlin to defend Berlin starting about April 17th. And what's interesting about them is these people have nothing left to lose. They're going to fight to the last man because basically they're a traitor against their own country. And if the Russians capture them, Russians don't treat German POWs, no matter who they are, well. And if the Western Allies get them, they're not going to, their own home country's not going to be happy with them, right? And so they're going to fight tooth and nail inside of, down to the last man of the can. They will eventually be ordered to break out on May 1, and some will try. Most will be, however, killed and captured by the Russians. And only a small group will make it to the American troops on the Elbe. And some of the SS Charlemagne, which are the French collaborators, they make it to the Western Allies on the Elbe. And General Leclerc, who's the head of the French Free Army, rounds up a bunch of them and just shoots them on the spot for having been traitors and for having fought for the Germans. So
Plus their SS. Makes it
plus
worse.
their SS on top of it. So the battle for the Reichstag, the heart of the city at the end, and this is where Hitler's got his bunker is in the base, the garden of the Chancellery building. And they're fighting this they're defending this tooth and nail. This is a step by step, house by house fight. It takes Hitler. It takes like a day just across the Moltke Bridge that goes across this River Spree there. Just swarms of troops charging over the bridge only to be gunned down, and the next swarm to go over, and the next swarm to go over. Hitler learns of Himmler attempting to contact Western allies to negotiate a settlement with the Western allies. And Hitler he's abandoned me. No, I totally do this. But eventually, Hitler commits suicide on April 30th. He's given up on Goering. He's given up on Himmler. He puts Goebbels in charge in Dönitz. Dönitz is outside the city, so he's going to run a government that's outside of Berlin. But Goebbels is still with Hitler in the bunker, and Goebbels is made like the president of the party. What's interesting about this very moment in time is that Himmler and Goebbels are under the impression that they can negotiate for the German government. And Himmler, in the movie The Bunker, they have Himmler saying, "Oh, they're not going to negotiate with you." And Himmler's like, "Oh, just give me an hour alone with Eisenhower. I will convince him." And I'm like, they're arrogant and delusional at this point. Hitler disavows Himmler, puts Goebbels in charge and Dönitz in charge. Goebbels is a diehard to the very end, and he'll play a role. Hitler will commit suicide on April 30th, and his body is burned in the garden of the Reichstag. And to try and prevent the Russians from desecrating him like they did. He's really fearful of what they did to Mussolini, where they strung up Mussolini and his mistress, and people abused the bodies after his death. After Hitler has died, the German troops in the area are all ordered to break out for the West, to give up the defense, but to break out for the West and keep the government going. I think it's interesting during this time that this is the Tiergarten near the Brandenburg Gate was used as an emergency airstrip, and this is a modern day picture of it. And they had a plane, and there was some talk about, should they fly Hitler out on a Junkers airplane that they had hidden away in a bunker? Should they do it or not? Anyway, on April 26th, Hanna Reich, who was a famed German test pilot, female test pilot, she flies in with Robert Ritter von Grimm. He's been declared the new head of the Luftwaffe after Goring's been kicked out. And they discuss evacuating Hitler by plane, and he's like, no, I'm going to stay in the city. So she leaves the Fuhrer bunker on the night of April 29th and takes off in this little Feischler Storch she's got here. She and Werder von Grimm take off and get out of Berlin. But the Soviets fire on that plane as it takes off, absolutely convinced that it's Hitler trying to get out of the city. They want to stop him from being able to escape. May 1st, 1945, Goebbels, who's now been put in charge of the government in Berlin, he sends General Krebs, who's one of the leading commanders of the Wehrmacht, to approach the Russians about negotiations. They get a local ceasefire, and he approaches General Chukov, who's in charge of one of the near surrounding Russian armies, and he's like, "I'm here to negotiate a peace." And Chukov looks at him, and Hitler's dead. Represent the government. I want to negotiate a peace. And Chukov looks at him and goes, the only the conditions we're going to accept are unconditional surrender. If you're prepared for unconditional surrender, we'll take that. Otherwise, sayonara, the fighting continues. So Krebs goes back knowing that Goebbels, being the hardliner is, will not accept unconditional surrender. They were really under the impression that they could negotiate a peace settlement at this point, where they haven't yet realized that the Allies are like, yeah, it's all or nothing. We're done with you people. And it's until Goebbels is gone, there's no hope of ending the conflict. Now, the picture in the lower left is a Tiger tank, Tiger 232, and it's one of the last defenders around the Tiergarten area, and that's the Brandenburg Gate in the background. And it was a little vignette that I saw on YouTube about this particular tiger. When the fighting stops, this tiger, which had fought right up through May 1st, and then finally got knocked out, this tiger becomes a very big trophy site. Russian soldiers just love to have their picture taken on this tiger tank with the Brandenburg Gate in the background. And that was what the YouTube video that I came across that started this thought for this discussion. The Tiger tank will be dragged away at some point, because by the time Western allies are admitted access to Berlin under Russian occupation, it's not there. So the only victory photos you've got of people standing on top of this tank are all just Russian. So here we are, May 45. You can see how much the Germans just barely control anywhere else. Their army is just collapsing. Goebbels and Krebs and some of the other leading generals all commit suicide at the end of the evening of May 1st. And now with Goebbels gone, the hardliners gone, and they leave this guy, Helmuth Wedling is in command of those forces in Berlin. And he says, all right, that's it. We're just going to surrender. We're not going to keep fighting. So he goes back to General Chukov and he says, all right, we're taking unconditional surrender. We'll stop fighting. And Chukov says, done deal. You stop the fighting, we'll stop the fighting. And Wedling arranges for a broadcast to be spread around Berlin, played around Berlin, ordering a ceasefire. And part of the broadcast is, he says the following: on April 30th, 1945, the Fuhrer committed suicide and thus abandoned those who had sworn loyalty to him. According to the Führer's order, you Germans would have to go on fighting for Berlin despite the fact that our ammunition is run out, and despite the general situation makes our further resistance meaningless. I order immediate cessation of his resistance. Every hour you keep on fighting prolongs the suffering of the civilians of Berlin and our wounded. Together with the commander-in-chief of the Soviet forces, I order you to stop fighting immediately. And so he's getting the German forces to put down their arms, and the fighting does in fact cease. What's interesting about General Wedling is that he's the last commander standing in Berlin. Everybody else has either gotten out or killed themselves. He will be taken prisoner by the Russians and held in Russian captivity until his death in the mid to late 50s. He will die in Russian captivity and never see the light of day again, basically. And then, so the battle is over, and it has been absolutely vicious battle. And I have heard this term before referred to. I remember reading a memoir of a civilian who lived in Berlin, who referred to the end of the war in Berlin as the year zero. And what they were meaning was that basically everything started over from scratch with absolutely new rules because the Russians were in charge. And everything you knew was there had been 360,000 Russian casualties to take this city. About a third of them were dead. Just the nasty, urban fighting is some of the nastiest fighting there is. The Russians were showing no mercy. They were all in a hot-headed race to get to Hitler. So they were just throwing troops at this battle. They think that 125,000 German civilians died during the fighting, and there's an unknown amount of military prisoners. They take 480,000 prisoners in the surrounding armies and everything that was surrounded by them. Another leading character of the German government is this Bormann. He's the secretary to Hitler, and he was in the bunker with Hitler at the end. He didn't commit suicide. There's definitely documented evidence that he tried to escape the bunker and get away. And there were many people trying to escape. Um, and for years, decades even, um, there was thoughts that Bormann had actually escaped Berlin and escaped Argentina. He was like one of these rumored kinds of people. Now, there were plenty of high-ranking SS officers who escaped Argentina. It's a known fact, right? Bormann didn't do it, and it's only in the 70s, I think, that they figured out that in fact Bormann had been either committed suicide or died trying to get through the Russian lines. And there was a report about somebody burying some bodies near a train station. And when they exhumed the bodies, they were able, through actually more recently in the 90s, through DNA, to prove that that was Bormann. What's interesting about the remains, so for instance, the Russians find the remains of Goebbels and his wife. They actually find the burnt remains of Hitler and the remains of Bormann when they're dug up in the 70s. The Russians will have those remains at various times absolutely cremated down to ash, and the ash spread in unknown areas. And their thinking was we did not want to create a burial site around which future Nazi sympathizers could rally around as a memorial site. The Russians were intent on just wiping these people from the face of history, if at all possible.
Didn't Austria do the same thing with Hitler's house?
Oh, like they did really?
They took it down
Yeah.
more recently.
They don't want to. They don't want to have it as a site, right?
Yep, for illegal activity, I might add.
There's been a picture of the German the civilians starting the cleanup of the city and the top, and take it probably in July. Down below, you see Russian soldiers celebrating the victory in 45. The entire German army, the rest of the German army, will surrender 6 days later under Dönitz's command. What the army that Dönitz had been up on the coast, the Baltic coast, and that's where we get the famous. It's 6 days later that we declare VE Day, victory in Europe, and the guns are last silent. So this Battle of Berlin was one of the most absolutely brutal battles of World War II. Just a horrific urban conflict, the worst kind of conflict you can imagine. And there had been many of these, right? The fighting in Leningrad was like this. The fighting in Stalingrad like this. Roughly at the same time as this is the fighting in Manila. where we've made reference to that before, where the Japanese did not declare Manila an open city, and just urban fighting is the worst kind there is, and it's just a horrific battle. But yeah, I think I don't know if you've ever seen the German movie The Bunker. I recommend it. It gives a sense of just how delusional they were at the end. And they get into a lot of these issues. And I just recently watched a historian reviewing the movie, and they thought they did a pretty good job with that movie. So this historian was going step by step through the movie, and it was a good
In that
job.
movie, I think the people outside the room in the hallway were not delusional. Only the people in the room with Hitler were Hitler himself.
Yeah.
You notice they thinned out pretty quick in the hallway.
Yep. So it's an interesting an apocalyptic. It's literally Armageddon. If there is ever been an Armageddon on the planet, it's like, wow, what a way to end the war. But um,
Well, in
I was
Europe, Bruce, the Eastern Front was very apocalyptic for the Germans and the Russians, whereas what we ran into going against Japan, it was just about everywhere.
yeah, right. It was that no holds barred, the fanatics,
Yes.
fight to the last man kind of thing, right?
The other thing I want to point out is that one reason the Russians paused in their offensive on Berlin is supplies. Every time they leapt forward, there was nothing to bring supplies up quick and easily for them. So they had to pause to build that supply line, that 300 miles of supplies, so that they could continue the fight. That's the other reason why we paused so much at the German western border, is because supply lines to our troops are pushed to the edge until after the bulge is done.
Yeah. That's true. I mean, the Germans had been taking, particularly on the Eastern Front, a scorched earth policy of tearing up railroad tracks and blowing up bridges. And so every river the Russians would get to, they'd have to rebuild bridges, sometimes under fire, before they could cross the river. So it was just absolutely brutal.
And then the Russians had a problem with
Hmm.
their own territory and the fact that they built their roads specifically not to handle mechanized armies. Even by today's standards, much of Russia is handled by two-lane roads that is usually bumper to bumper traffic, because by having the superhighways we have here in the States, or that Europe has, just helps bring the armies moving faster.
No, so we don't want that. So we're going to have poor infrastructure just to slow you
well, right, yeah. It's a defensive move basically as opposed to an offensive move.
Yeah, my friend Herman, who's been recently to Russia, says that's the way the roads are, except for in and around Moscow. They're all two-lane bump, and they're crowded bumper to bumper with trucks and cars,
Mm.
because they don't want to build the superhighways to make it convenient for invasion.
Yeah. Bruce, we were in Berlin about a year and a half ago. As one of those Viking cruise things. We started up there. We spent an extra couple days. And Bruce, I just forwarded you a couple of photos. One of the things we noticed in East Berlin, and by the way, the city has been, the recovery is amazing. There's we stayed in a Marriott hotel that actually straddles what used to be the wall. Um, but there's still buildings, especially on the eastern side, where they did not do a lot of reconstruction, a lot of repair and stuff. But there's many buildings that still are very pockmarked with bullet holes and stuff. And just it's very interesting. Yep, there we go.
There's
Hey,
your really just so that's
yeah.
your hotel?
No, that's not the hotel. That's a building. The hotel was ultra modern. It was, it was built in the 70s or 80s. Well, no, actually, no, it was built after the fall of the wall,
But
so it had to be
you can walk
89.
around Berlin and see buildings that look like this.
Yeah, yeah. Look,
The
there it
eastern
is.
side, yeah, Bruce.
Yeah. There's one museum where it's a big museum building with big stone columns and stuff, and the columns are all chopped up.
Yeah.
And they have not restored it.
Hmm.
I guess, from a financial standpoint and also as sort of a memoriam standpoint.
My
So
wife
Bruce,
Susan remains the only one in our families that I know of who's ever been to the divided Berlin, crossing at Checkpoint Charlie.
Yeah. They've also touristized the city quite a bit. There's you can go to Checkpoint Charlie and there's a little um guard station there with with the windows and stuff, but it's all reconstructed. The originals are all torn down and removed. But somebody put that up there to basically attract tourists and be able to charge them money for a tour.
Yeah.
so I have one point on the war itself, the battle. There's a huge advantage to what happened in that battle. The Germans were convinced that they lost the war, which was not the case 20 years earlier.
Yep.
Oh yeah, right.
And then today, we read about how Germany is rapidly rearming, but nobody views that with fear.
No, because they hopefully learned their lesson, right? They weren't able to come up with we were defeated by the fifth element. Nope, you were defeated by
And that's
Russian armies.
0 day, 0 year. It's real.
Yeah, there
Well,
was.
for a long time, I believe the Constitution prohibited them from having troops anywhere but Germany, and that was overridden essentially during one of the, I think, conflicts in the Mideast.
And my experience in living in Germany for 6 years back in the 80s was late 70s, early 80s, is that the people there uh, we're learning from the United States the advantage of not wanting to go out and pick fights with anybody. The peaceful side of it was more enjoyable than the thought of warfare as they had experienced 30 years earlier.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, it was
Thank you, Bruce.
it's interesting and scary time. But it's almost like that this horror had to happen to end the horror that was the Nazi regime. To John's point,
Yeah.
it had to be unquestionably the end of that awful regime, you know?
So people speculate if there was no Hitler, what would have happened to Europe with Stalin? So Hitler counterbalanced Stalin and brought him to a standstill.
Oh, in other words, Stalin unchecked might have wound up
So
with.
the question is whether Stalin was expansionist, and the idea is that he had been,
Well,
but we'll never know.
Yeah, that's the point. We'll never know. I mean, his thoughts never came out beyond uh, beyond his fear of the rearming of Germany. The one advantage we do know is that from about 1921, 22, Stalin was aware that Germany was rearming and slowly rebuilding its military. And even though he was participating in it and helping them, he was also very fearful of a rearmed Germany.
Yeah. German tank units and Air Force units would practice in Russia
Yes.
prior
right.
to the
So
war.
the Holocaust kills approximately 20 million people, right? And the rest of the war, or is it 20 million and then the whole war? I can't remember the numbers. And I think the Holocaust is 10 and another 10 million on top of it or something.
No, it's more than that, Bruce.
Okay,
There were more than 10 million Russians killed.
yeah. So anyway, millions of people, tens of millions of people killed. You're
If you
right.
do the math, it was several thousand people every day in
Right.
Russia dying. We
And
had bad casualties.
so fascism bad, worth 40, 50 million people, let's say.
Yeah.
But I
Or
remember
I
that
just
about 25 years ago, there was a little book came out called The Little Red Book, and it tallied up the deaths of communist regimes. And if you took the Russians themselves, the Chinese under Mao, and the Cultural Revolution, and it was like a factor of two. Like fascism bad, pure communism also very bad. Like
Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah, the AI
well,
response from Google is that 75 to 80 million total fatalities.
okay.
52 million civilian,
Well, if
25.
AI said it's true, since we know that about you, Frank,
Well, that's why I prefaced it. That's why I prefaced with the AI response as opposed to,
I'll send you that PDF so you can share it with your family and just show them all the adventures you've been on.
Yeah, I may actually the club has a movie night every year where people put together videos. I might actually show that this year. So here's the comedy thing.
Well, I can. Yeah.
I'll
If
get
you
I'll
do
get
it right, Frank, under PowerPoint, you can add music and create a little video
yeah.
and record it out as a video. As
Well, on your
opposed to
voiceover of how you're
presentation.
having that, I can just hear Frank voicing over his specific adventures. So.
Yeah, yeah.
So the Goddard Demerong for this.
Yeah, I'll give the Kernan brothers credit,
Yeah.
directorial and producer credit.
Well, thanks everybody for switching to a Thursday. Sorry I had to do it. Our June meeting at the date to be yet determined will be our friend Mike McKay, who comes on these regularly. He has just finished a 700-mile bike trip on the Oregon Trail, and will be telling us his history and impressions of the Oregon Trail. And he puts out a daily note on his travels, and it really is based on that kids card game. If you guys ever heard of it, the Oregon Trail, where everybody dies of dysentery.
You died of dysentery.
Yeah, he's like, he really framed his commentary around this is what it's like to ride the Oregon Trail today, and see some of those sites and the museums he visited. So that'll be our June talk. And then we'll have our July quiz hosted by Kayak
Right.
Frank himself. So
Thank you, Bruce.
All right, thanks, Bruce.
Thanks, everybody.
See you all.
Slappers.
Hey, Phil, are you gonna be in Lancaster?
Yes, I'll be there in July.
All right.